When we refer to psychic structure, we do not mean to imply that personality is comprised of fixed or static attributes or properties or traits. Rather, structure should be conceived as unconscious organizational processes that provide certain functional semblances of continuity and self-cohesion. Psychic structure is constituted through an unconscious agency as a confluence of process systems, and they provide an organizational and adaptational functions to inner experience which are relatively enduring and invariant. But this does not mean that structure does not change. On the contrary, the self is always in a state of unrest and flux, even if such activity is inhibited. Therefore, psychic structure, like the self, is a dialectical process of becoming, which is continually plagued by negativity and conflict. Now, patients with attachment pathology, what I mean by that is that people who haven't really been able to form a connection or emotional sense of attachment to other people, they often have like a personality organization that, at least in North America, is referred to as a borderline. In Europe, they usually call it like an actual neurosis, or they call it hysteria. But these types of borderline levels are generally disorganized, or they're detached, or they have traumatized profiles. And they're often with fragmented or depleted self-structures marked by extremities in clinical presentation. Now, in my clinical work and my observations, I've identified 5 subgroups of patients that I frequently encounter. And that's what I wanted to focus more on today. I talk about them as being organized at different developmental structural levels of the psyche. Namely, those who have structural trauma, who have structural fragmentation, structural depletion, structural vacuity, or emptiness, and structural aggressivity, aggression. Now, these 5 subcategories are by no means exhaustive or conclusive. I'm just merely concerned here with conceptualizing how these operate on psychic structure. That's primarily gathered from my clinical practice. So let us begin with structural trauma. Patients with structural trauma often see themselves as hopelessly damaged, maimed, or defective. There's a fixation on being abused and spoiled, like some kind of sullied object that's permanently mangled. Therefore, their self-representation and personal identity are rendered helplessly molested and repetitiously victimized by an ongoing internalized sense of violation and deformity. Now, this fixation is experientially realized as a gaping wound in their being, a slash in their very existence. Psychic pain remains organized around the trauma, a relentless assault on the integrity of the self. Now, the phenomenology of their inner experience centers around being desecrated or torn, like left for dead. Patients with this structural disconfiguration have a damaged core, the acute feelings of which are those of helplessness, of shame, of humiliation, that heighten the intensity of devaluation and psychic pain. Now, often patients with structural trauma have severe attachment deficits. They they can't really connect to people. And then they also have severe dissociative profiles. They're profoundly mistrustful, distant, and aloof. There's a feeling of detachment and derealization that are common defensive organizations that allow the self to survive. Now, while the traumatized self survives, it's still broken, if not destroyed, tormented by the sadistic brutality of memory. Now, traumatized patients suffer the horrible exposure, humiliation, and affective resonance of bearing a damaged psyche. With severe trauma, psychic structure is always fighting the experience and tendency towards fragmentation. Patients with structural fragmentation often present in a constant state of agitation, hovering on panic and doom. When the self begins to fracture, it leads into an abyss of annihilatory, disintegrative, and decompensating inner experiences. Structural fragmentation corresponds with looming annihilation anxieties. The anticipation of fragmentation induces annihilation panic, and the self begins to undergo a breaking apart, a splintering of consciousness. Here, patients descend into a spiral regression of persecutory and disembodied torment. Patients with this level of insidious regression plummet into a psychotic core. As self-structure attempts to organize itself around pockets or semblances of containment, psychotic anxieties often become too overwhelming. Paranoia, even delusions and hallucinations are internally constructed and projectively superimposed onto external reality as a crude means of preserving the self and protecting it from total annihilation. So psychosis thus becomes a means of imposing some kind of control and order on the imminent disintegration of the self. Fragmentation panic occurs when psychic structure is imperiled by experiential dysregulation, a fracturing, a cutting up, and a dismembering of self-continuity and cohesion. Here the self becomes divided and diffuse. What's most horrific is the anticipatory fear of complete deracination, namely the expectation of non-being, death. Fragmented patients seem to be always living on a precipice of annihilation anxiety, what I would refer to as psychic purgatory. Fragmentation threats summon paranoid and psychotic anxieties, further triggering this annihilation panic and this primitive splitting that takes place in the psyche, a fracturing up of mind. As a result, the self becomes dislocated and persecuted by the fear of annihilation. Now, when what we call schizoid mechanisms, these splitting off mechanisms, when those fail, the self is imperiled by the return of this projected persecutory fantasies, or oppressive guilt, or death wishes. When crippling anxiety, panic, and psychosis is not present, the traumatized self tends to find another avenue in order to survive. Here enters the realm of detachment, impoverishment, and depression. Now, so far, I've been speaking about extreme cases, emphasizing the effects of trauma on character structure. But there are more benign, less insidious forms of developmental trauma, informing attachment vulnerabilities and dysfunctional adaptation patterns that organize around more depleted aspects and qualities in self-structure. Patients with structural depletion fall on a continuum ranging from more agitated and restless, or what we call dysphoric tendencies. Dysphoria is like an agitated depression. Those harnessed from more fragmentary propensities, to those that are more structurally depressed and internally empty. Let us first look at structural depletion proper. Depleted psychic structure is more or less the personality. Is vapid, it's deflated, it lacks vitality. Patients have very blunted inner life and a very restricted range of emotional expression. They often complain of not feeling connected to their inner affective states, which seem to be segregated, detached, and compartmentalized. There is a very weak and torpid sensation of absence and melancholia. Clinical depression is a very common dimension of their life histories and can organize around loss, complicated mourning, abandonment, rejection from dependency figures, emotional estrangement from people, and a sense of alienation to numbing and anaclitic depressive manifestations. Patients with structural depletion have a depressive core, a characterological dysthymia. So instead of like major depressive symptoms, this is more part of a person's character structure. Those with dysphoric or hypomanic proclivities may slip into restlessness, agitation, and or fragmentation, accompanied by regression and depressed mood. They often absorb a pervasive oppression and meaninglessness to their existence, lack interest or enthusiasm in life activities, are physically lethargic, languid, and apathetic, are somatically focused, and they can retreat into substances, addictions, or food for numbing purposes. Consider the case of Winnie, a 39-year-old divorced white female who sought out long-term psychoanalytic treatment because psychopharmacological intervention proved to be of little help. Winnie complained of feeling like a whipped dog with a broken spirit, unable to shake herself loose from the melancholic grip of indifference and lethargy that drained her very sense of feeling alive. During our initial consultation, I asked her what she believed to be the ultimate cause of her malaise, and she replied that she didn't have a clue. It soon became apparent that Winnie had suffered in silence from many developmental traumas that had left a wake of characterological depression. She had endured an early childhood of constant parental negativity, emotional invalidation, and a plethora of devaluing remarks about her selfhood and capacities, which she internalized and adopted as her inner self-representational world. She left home at 15, had a child out of wedlock when she was 17, had abused drugs and alcohol, and was on her third marriage at the time of our treatment. Her first husband was an unavailable alcoholic, while her second husband was emotionally devaluing and verbally aggressive. She described her current husband as nice but aloof. She had an entrenched repetition of picking cold, volatile, and humiliating men like her father, who was verbally abusive, dismissive, shameful, and showed no warmth or love, as well as her mother, who was emotionally unavailable and delivered beatings with a belt strap when she challenged her authority. The patient reports scant memories of her early childhood, and those she has are tainted with negativity and parental neglect. Throughout our treatment, the patient began to realize that she had incorporated many of these negative introjects and endured many developmental traumas that had formed the sediment of her depleted psychic structure. Her parents' deprivation and critical judgment of her became the foundation of her own impoverished representational world. And their lack of physical affection and warmth left an analytic neediness, a physical neediness, which she compensatorily acted out through her promiscuity and her substance use. During the course of some deeply painful emotional work, the patient reported a screen memory of being abandoned in her crib and utterly left alone, helpless and terrified. This association was followed up by a memory of being told by her mother, quote, "I wish I never had you." Upon this disclosure, she remembered asking her parents during early adolescence, "Why don't you love me?" Winnie felt that she was not worthy of love, and this explained why she was never given hugs nor told she was valued. This was her fantasy. Over the course of therapy, Winnie gradually became more assertive, self-assured, and capable of discerning her own authentic emotional states. When she realized that she had repetitiously allowed others to devalue and use her unjustly as an unconscious attempt to win over her parents' recognition and love, she was able to disengage from her maladaptive pattern of manufacturing unavailable and exploitive relationships and began to more accurately perceive her interpersonal environment and set appropriate boundaries and limitations when conflict arose. This shift allowed a vitalization of her psyche that combated her depressive core. The genuine engagement of her inner experiences further served as a catalyst for enacting more spontaneous and creative self-expressions of her individuality and autonomy. Now, when depletion advances further, it enters into a no man's land of emotional detachment, isolation, and dissociative void. I wish to distinguish between the phenomenology of structural depletion, like Winnie, and structural emptiness, the latter being a more severe manifestation of characterological depression. Here the psyche is shut off and enveloped in a vacuum of solipsistic withdrawal and isolation, disengagement from the intersubjective world, and unfathomable aloneness. Patients with structural vacuity have an empty core, a lacuna in their very being. Patients with this profile may appear to be in a state of derealization, as if they're going through the motions of living in routine banality. Schizoid and schizoid-typal patients, as well as the dissociative and more classic borderline conditions, comprise this subgroup, where depression is taken to the extreme mode of numbing and anesthetized detachment. People merely become things, robots, zombies, dulled to their inner fluctuations of affective life and social participation. These patients seem to be too far gone, unable to feel or reach into the yoke of their existence. They appear to be simply devoid of emotions, which are in actuality sealed off in an airtight container, suffocated, strangulated by death. They have the appearance of the walking dead. You ever see people just like a piece of wood? They are often so horrifically traumatized by their past that they kill themselves off internally, their inner experience. And they don't grant it a life, let alone a voice. So they don't have to live with the pain and anxiety that threatens to torment their souls. So it's a defensive function here. Patients with such empty structures are plummeted into a black abyss of nothingness. They're consumed by lack, absence, and void, a hole in being. Subjective reports of emotional experience are described like there's something missing, as if feelings and desire have been surgically removed. Psychosocial development appears almost arrested, and they're literally loners and interpersonal hermits. This is not merely existential alienation or isolation, but disembodied automatization, like living death. While there are many and qualitative degrees of emptiness and aloneness that plague the structural integrity in a variety of different clinical syndromes, those with these vacuous character structures have entered the realm of horrific excess, swallowed by a dark pit. All need for human connection has been renounced. They literally lack the capacity for attachment. Warren, a 24-year-old single white male, was hospitalized for suicidal ideation and chronic depression. He was admitted three times to psychiatric facilities in his late teens and followed by 3 different psychiatrists who had prescribed him a cornucopia of mood stabilizers, antidepressants, and antipsychotic medication, none of which were effective. A side note, any people who have personality disorders, character structures, medication doesn't do anything for them. It just maybe might, dampen a little bit of the symptoms, but it doesn't offer a curative factor. Hence, modern-day psychiatry is a farce when it comes to treating personality disorders. Back to Warren. He further entered into a residential treatment facility for 6 months, receiving both individual and group therapy, but claimed these interventions had no impact either. Now, when I met the patient, he had already been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, social phobia, avoidant personality disorder, and on and on. It became salient that he had a primary schizoid presentation, concomitant with a chronic characterological dysthymia. Warren reported that he never felt happy as a child, and in fact confessed that he did not even know the experiential meaning of the word. He could not recall one memory of his parents when he was a child, let alone describe to me what they had looked like. As he told me, quote, "I can remember their bodies like being in the house or something, but not their faces." Right there it tells you he's never internalized a loving introject. The maternal face is everything for a child. The transgenerational transmission of attachment pathology in this family was more than obvious. He reported that his mother was a depressed, aloof, bitter alcoholic who was sexually, physically, and emotionally abused as a child. How is someone like that going to be able to provide a healthy attachment to their child? And the father was a cold, distant, insensitive, and hostile individual with a bad temper who was never home. Lovely combo. Warren said that he never felt though they were truly his parents, and he wondered if he'd been adopted. Apparently, his parents had a very rocky marriage, slept in separate beds for years, and divorced when the patient was 13 after the father discovered his mother was having an affair. The patient reported that he felt odd and excluded, ridiculed and picked on by other children, and he never formed any friendships or attachment to his peers. He described his childhood as replete with anxiety, instability, rejection, social ostracization, and being physically beat up and bullied. To make matters worse, he had moved approximately every year and a half until his parents divorced due to the nature of his father's work, thus creating more difficulties in adjusting to his novel social and school environments. Warren's early attachment deficits predisposed him to develop a very empty core structure. The very fabric of his personality was dearth, dread, and internal aloneness, enveloped by a bleak ocean of nothingness. This had left a massive void and of agitated depression. And as a result, he struggled with chronic dysphoria, peppered with social rejection and aversion that was exacerbated in various interpersonal contexts. His social phobias and anxieties were particularly related to being judged, disparaged, and shamed by other people, including his parents, who had given up hope that he would just snap out of it. He developed an avoidant pattern of behavior very early in life in order to remove himself from situations in which he would potentially become subjected to humiliation, abuse, or social denunciation. As a result, he withdrew, shut down, and sealed off his emotional life, and retreated into his own stoical universe. The detachment and renunciation of his need and desire to connect with others was a way to protect his inner self from annihilation. He learned that he could trust no one and developed a paranoid wall of impenetrability in allowing others to hurt him. Yet at the same time, he could not escape their painful intrusions, abnegation and devaluing insults, which he absorbed like a sponge. Alcohol dependency was a substitute for the analytic and relational craving he had to deny within himself in order to survive such a depriving and hostile reality. But his structural emptiness and depression had left him with the preoccupation of ending his life. He reported he had no vision of a future, for all hope for a better existence was expunged from his realm of possibility. According to the patient, he had burned all bridges toward getting a proper education, was financially impoverished, and dependent upon welfare, and feared flipping burgers or being a laborer living in a cheap house. The absence of attachment with structural trauma that devolves into unremitting depletion and emptiness is truly a tragic and unbearable subjective reality. In the end, he said, I have no joy in anything, and I feel like I'm just waiting to die. As we have seen, trauma can lead to many different orientations and degrees of psychic organization and functional adaptation, from more agitated, fragmentary, and hyper-aroused structural processes to more defensive and empty instantiations. The degree to which the psyche is oriented toward a primary structuralization over another is largely based on the unique subjectivity of each individual and the contingencies that each faces. Recall that structure is the succession of organizational processes influenced by unconscious agency and is largely the constitution of defense. More or less, our psyches, our personalities, are constituted by the defenses that we adopt internally. Defenses become organized into functional patterns of behavior and adaptability, and is never ontologically separated from one's social and interpersonal world, hence one's object relations. But what happens when the psychic register identifies with violence that is imposed upon it by trauma, so much so that it becomes violence? Here enters another subgroup of attachment disordered patients, those with structural aggressivity. Patients with aggressive organizations are saturated with negativity, hate, rage, and destruction. Their psychic structure is suffused with chaos, invasion, animosity, and militancy that are internally absorbed and externally split off, projected, and violently channeled. Developmental trauma is perceived and felt as a pernicious assault on the structural integrity of the self, which is combated with the same fierceness and level of barbarity. Defensive manifestations are mobilized around survival, and the most primitive impulses are summoned and sustained in order to fend off the perceived onslaught on the self. Unlike the destructive principle, which is turned onto the self in fragmentary and depressive structures, we may conjecture that psychic energy is deflected from inversion and primarily redirected toward the object world. So instead of the depressive turning aggression on themselves, here they identify with the aggressor and they want to violently combat the people they encounter or the world they encounter. This is a primary identification with those who inflict trauma as a primitive reaction and bid for intrapsychic survival. Unfortunately, this soils character structure with an unremitting, sadistic, and violent negativity. The other becomes the generalized enemy, not to be trusted or loved, but distanced from, if not destroyed. But the aggressed and aggressive self wages an inner war that cannot be won, for brutality is ultimately enacted through tormenting, internalized representations and self-destruction. Attachment to others are violent, unpredictable, cruel, and manipulative, as often seen in the paradigmatic antisocial and borderline syndromes, or the psychopaths. Psychic reality is embroiled in havoc and ruin, always tearing with the negative. Patients with this psychic structure have an aggressive or violent core, marked by conflict and inner implosion. The world becomes a nemesis that is ruthless, persecutory, and dangerous, and this becomes the prototype for human relatedness. Human tenderness and vulnerability are disavowed, if not aborted altogether, out of fear of exploitation, sabotage, and death of the self. The self hostilely defines itself in relation to opposition, which the self must negate. As a result, the other becomes an antagonistic, malignant imposition that must be opposed, contained, controlled, and dominated. Patients with this personality structure are tormented with negativity. They can find no refuge or peace from the condemning, malicious, and haunting introjects, memories, and developmental traumas that have formed the sediment of their inner representational worlds and self-identity. Less severe forms of aggressivity come out in competition, intellectual argumentation, interpersonal command, and exhibitionistic power. To pleasure in inflicting pain onto others through oral means, such as verbal remarks, sardonic deprecation, and manipulative threats. For example, Steve, a 36-year-old successful entrepreneur, saw me for, I don't know if they have this condition here in the Azores, but back home we call it anger management. So he came to see me for anger management. He worked 14-hour days in a highly stressful and competitive job. Never saw his wife or children, and when he was home on the weekends, he would displace his frustration on his family by initiating arguments, thus escalating into yelling rampages, and physically kick and bang objects. He reported feeling tense and angry throughout most of the day for years, was constantly gritting his teeth and clenching his fists in his office, swearing at the slightest irritant, and becoming so exasperated at the littlest things that he would become enraged and explosive. For example, he got his coat stuck on the door handle, and instead of removing it gently, he ripped it off. Items in the garage would be arbitrarily smashed, and the family dog would become the object of routine beatings when it disobeyed. People were always a source of opposition or in his way. Road rage was a daily occurrence. Even his dentist told him that if he didn't stop grinding his teeth, he would require serious surgery. You could imagine unconsciously the aggression, whether it be all day or at night during sleep. After many verbally hostile and profane exchanges with his wife, she threatened to leave him if he didn't get help. That's what usually happens with anger management. Somebody got in trouble, they're in the courts, wife's going to leave you. Upon my initial consultation, I asked him, "How long have you felt angry?" "My whole life," he replied. Steve revealed that he was systematically picked on, bullied, chased home from school, and beaten up on almost a daily basis from the time he entered kindergarten until 8th grade. His parents were concerned but passive. They were not very helpful in protecting him, nor were school authorities. He would suffer horrible humiliations in front of his peers and classmates, and his beatings were pervaded with shame and depredation. For instance, gangs of kids would swarm over him on the playground or on his way home, corner him at school, and incessantly tease, ridicule, and badger him. He lived in constant fear and panic. In many ways, Steve stood out as the class geek. He was always a tall and lanky kid with glasses, nicely dressed and from a rich family, yet he was quiet, shy, and withdrawn. He had a heart murmur from infancy onward, which interfered with his respiration, and as a result, could not participate in sports or gym. The other children, mainly boys, but girls as well, would verbally degrade him through name-calling, and would often surprise him in the hall, knock books out of his hand, steal his belongings out of his locker, throw gum in his hair during class, and when he was older, hit him on the top of the head with their class rings. He would often be made to fight younger kids and was warned if he won, the older bullies would beat him up more severely. He was made to beg for mercy, only to be hit and laughed at after doing so, thus sacrificing his self-respect and dignity. When the patient was 8, 2 older boys pummeled him in an alley and made him get on his knees to perform fellatio. When he refused, he trembled in tears as they urinated all over his face, hair, and body. Then they beat and kicked him, and they smashed his bike. The unimaginable shame and defloration coarsened his psyche with hate and murderous rage, which he had to indignantly swallow his whole life. During our initial meeting, he told me that he had never thought of nor told anyone of his childhood pain and rage for over 20 years. The shame and vulnerability from his confession was so unbearable that he had an abreaction. It was reportedly the first time he had cried about it since the incident. Throughout therapy, Steve began to trace back elements of his own misogynistic feelings to his mother, who used to call him a wimp and a sissy for not fighting back, as well as toward girls at school who would instigate other boys to pick on him. He came to realize that his hostile feelings toward his wife was partly due to his early affective coloration, and his generalized rage toward the world was the result of unprocessed trauma, thus besieging his psychic cohesion. The channelization of negativity outward is an abortive attempt to protect the self from annihilation, and in this regard is generally a more adaptive defense than succumbing to the downward plunge of fragmentation, anxiety, or depletion. But this style is ultimately just as pathological. There is a continual immersion in the trauma that is continuously re-traumatizing, to the point the psychic structure becomes trauma, both violently inflicted and assimilated. The psyche cannot rest and is flooded with revenge, which ultimately comes back to taunt and haunt structural integrity. In conclusion, we've seen how developmental trauma erodes healthy attachment capacities and predisposes psychic structure toward borderline and schizoid levels of organization. It should be noted that anyone with these clinical profiles can potentially exhibit structural shifts in self-states. They can be continuous with one another, such as with dysphoria and paranoia, and show overlap in inner organizational processes, content, and form. In other words, each of these clinical subcategories may possess shared qualities and experiential functions, thus producing hybrid manifestations in clinical presentations. While neither conclusive nor exhaustive, these 5 subclassifications of structuralization are merely appearances or forms of attachment-related developmental trauma. Because psychic structure may mutate and transmogrify, it can exhibit combinations of these complex and overdetermined states, modify and adapt to various contingencies, or it may regress to more earlier developmental constellations and primitive aspects of being, experiencing, and relating to others. Regardless of individual and cultural differences, developmental trauma scars the psyche. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Niels, for your interesting talk.
Thank you.
E questões que queiram e gostassem de colocar aqui ao professor. Aqueles de vocês, portanto, a maioria que aqui está é ainda aluna do curso de Psicologia. Vocês tiveram aqui uma pequena amostra dos casos com que irão trabalhar se enveredarem pela psicologia clínica, não é? Portanto, estiveram aqui com os casos que o professor John Mills trouxe aqui para ilustrar a sua conferência, portanto, ficaram com uma ideia mais clara de que se pode encontrar portanto, nesta área. E penso que é uma ótima oportunidade para colocarem as vossas questões, as vossas dúvidas. Eu vou-me socorrer aqui, nós temos aqui a professora Débora que fará a tradução daqueles que tenham mais alguma dificuldade em colocar a questão em inglês, porque o inglês já é incomparavelmente melhor do que o meu, como já terão também notado, e portanto seria agora a altura para aproveitarmos aqui a presença do professor João Nilson para vocês, sobretudo que eles também têm a disciplina da professora Débora, que têm que fazer a vossa tarefa, por alguma questão que depois pudessem ilustrar na tarefa que têm que entregar.
Sure. Yeah.
Sim, temos.
So I'm not from the area, but I kind of have a question. So you define them as personality disorders, right? So how conscious these people are, because they're different from mental disorders, right? And somehow. So how conscious these people, because you've described some severe cases, and I've been wondering how conscious they are about their stages.
The language in North America would certainly look at personality disorders as mental illness, whereas in other parts of the world might want to separate the personality from, like, let's say, schizophrenia or severe psychotic or severe clinical depression. So basically the people I'm talking about are quite severely ill, even though they might be more functional, where they can hold jobs than those who need to be institutionalized. The question about how conscious are they of their conditions, to presuppose the term consciousness, is that they would be conscious of things that bother them. The question would be, are they self-conscious of the causes of their suffering? And so through the course of various treatments, people become much more attuned, much more self-conscious that they grew up in families that traumatized them, emotionally, let's say. Maybe physically, maybe sexually, maybe, emotionally. But they feel horribly, traumatized in some sense. And that's what I'm trying to refer to as developmental traumas. So it could be very severe. Those who, are much more inclined toward, detaching from any sense of connection to other people, or looking at them as things or objects that are out in the world, to struggling with internal experiences and needs and desires for connection with others, but others are either perceived as depriving, as devaluing, hostile, and hence they could develop all kinds of defensive reactions. So, for instance, the person who doesn't trust other people, often that interferes with their capacity for intimacy, for developing connections or friendships, or having families, or being able to relate to friends, let alone their children. And so there's going to be various degrees of consciousness about their condition. But usually a successful therapy will lead them to be much more conscious of what they went through as a kid, how does that affected them in terms of their personalities and their life, their view of the world. And when there's healing done, when there's a working through of those types of developmental experiences, they become more aware. And we can't really change. We can't live a better existence unless we have more knowledge and insight into who we are. So I hope that's answered your question.
So the cases you described of people having crises in their mid-30s or even 40s, so I'm wondering whether they become conscious themselves and realize that and approach you as a therapist themselves. Is it through some other practices? I don't know. That was,
Well, yeah, people come into the office for all kinds of reasons. Usually there's some precipitating events that have happened. Let's say you said, a midlife crisis or something, whatever that means, meaning that it might be a lot of different things for different people. They may have gone through their whole life, struggling, but usually on an unconscious level, internally, struggling, but not being able to consciously articulate what's troubling them. Exactly. But when they do come in, they might think it's this thing here, like something on the surface, something work, family, an event, a death, a disappointment, and then we often find out that the intensity of that crisis or life experience has all these layers, all these unconscious layers that go back. Hence, they've been struggling with it, and this one precipitating event that brought them in was enough to stir up those childhood wounds. And then they didn't realize what they were getting into when they came to see me, but then those who stay realize the value of having to work through their internal conflicts.
So it kind of comes through self-awareness to the end, I guess, through therapy.
Yeah, that very much is the type of treatment or type of therapy I practice, rather than what you probably are more accustomed to hearing, such as cognitive behavioral, interventions. Just think this happy thought and you'll be fine.
Okay. We have more questions.
Good afternoon, I'm Vanessa.
Hi, Vanessa.
I'm very happy that you are here. It's an honor. I don't know if you prefer Dr. or Professor John.
John's fine.
Okay, John. Okay. So I thought it was very interesting when you spoke about the structural depletion, where you mentioned Winnie's example. I think is where this is introduced. So you mentioned that she resorted to substance abuse to control her emotions because of her tough childhood, so to speak. Would you say that because of her tough childhood, that those developmental strategies helped with the upcoming of her personality disorder?
Well, I think clearly that she had three marriages. Struggled throughout her whole life in various relationships, also with her child, and substance abuse, going from partner to partner as a way of filling that sense of depletion was, I think, primarily unconsciously her way of trying to overcompensate for all these deprivations, and the inner feelings of lack, and the sense of not really feeling any sense of aliveness. The people who prefer addictions or prefer substances often these are like secondary defensive attempts at shoring up these kinds of internal fracturings or depletions or anxieties. So it's very common. I mean, we see addiction all over the world. Why is it? Often people in that state, in those moments, are feeling an elevation of consciousness. But often when they're not using is when they have a crash. And so, and then you see a repetition or a cycle, right, of depletion, high, depletion. And to the point that people can become quite depressed and suicidal. Yeah.
And would you also think that because Winnie, I suppose because of the last husband, because he was violent to her and, well, just a generally violent person, would you think that she was looking for her parents in those marriages because she kept on getting involved with relationships that resembled her childhood?
Yes.
She was looking for some type of comfort, so to speak.
I think the point, actually the point I believe also kind of mirrors your point, that people aren't like consciously saying to themselves, gee, I'm going to go out and I'm going to pick an asshole. and I'm going to pick somebody who's going to beat me. It's more unconsciously, I'm somehow drawn to this negative person because I in the back of their head it's like, that was my dad. Or why am I attracted to people who put me down all the time? Maybe that was my mother. And yet there's a sense of familiarity. And because of the familiarity and the sense of, I never really felt liked or loved or people gave me respect, I don't really expect it. So I'm more kind of comfortable being in this subservient, masochistic position or role. And at least somebody wants me. And then when they come to realize, oh my God, what am I doing? These are bad people. This is horrible for me. I don't need to be connected with these losers. Then they start making better choices. They pick better people, whether it be friends, whether it be intimate loved ones, etc. And they realize, I still have a family. And I have to deal with this. How do I deal with my family that I still have to see? And how do I work through that? And so that brings up a lot of different ambivalences and more conflicts that now that they're more self-aware is fueling these dynamics.
Another question?
Hi, thank you again for your presentation. So I wanted to ask you, what's your theory model? How do you intervene with your patients, clients here? You told about the self-awareness. Can you explain more in a practical way?
Sure.
How do you intervene to get to the clients to a realization or not a realization?
Self-awareness.
Oh, yes.
Well, I'm a psychoanalyst. And as a psychoanalyst, we're trained with different theoretical models, and I don't really identify with one school. But if I did have to pick one approach that we might refer to as a therapeutic action, I would consider myself more aligned with the relationalists, and the relational psychoanalytic community values the fact that you're developing a relationship with your client or patient, whatever the term you use, and that's also prefaced on attachment theory. So the whole notion here is that whoever's coming in my office, whatever their background is, whatever their developmental traumas are, I have the task of having to relate to them. And how do you first get to know a stranger? It's becoming very acutely aware and attuned to their inner experiences. And being attuned to their inner experience is just letting them tell you about their life story. And yet being affectively attuned, being in touch with their emotional life, and helping them come to understand it. But there's really no step-by-step stage here. I mean, you might read it in a textbook, it says you do this or this or this, but in reality, therapy is a process. And you're dealing with a unique individual right in front of you. It's not, I'm not going to assume who this person is. So the task is they have to feel a sense of trust. And how do they feel a sense of safety with me? Is for me to listen and to be attuned and connected to their inner experience. And if they feel that, and particularly if they feel that they're being felt, you know when you feel you're being felt by another person, that there's a sense of empathy, there's a sense of connection that you have, there's a specialness there that you don't get every day in life, not even with your own family or spouse. So this is a process of becoming over time, and part of it is when that client, person in front of me, feels safe with me, then they can start to unpack other things that are very difficult internally for them to talk about or experience. And then there's a slow working through process that takes place. And as long as they don't feel I'm going to judge them or invalidate them, but rather affirm them and allow them to unpack their inner experience, and we're here to try to understand it together, they become more insightful in who they are over time.
How could you distinguish stress, post-traumatic disorder, stress from this borderline personality? The personality disorders are too complicated to diagnose, so
Well,
cases of the childhood traumas, how would be the line?
well, that's a very good question, and it's also one that cannot be simplistically answered. For instance, we might start with the assumption that people have a disorder, and that we just need to understand the syndromes and symptoms and course and etiology, and then we can come up with a diagnosis. But that's simply a social construction. We just manufacture that as professionals. It's used as a heuristic that allows us to navigate. In reality, the person who has PTSD often has all kinds of early other traumas, and hence this one traumatic event can unconsciously evoke all these other things that happen to them, and hence they have a full-blown syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder. However, other people can go through the same traumatic event and they're shook up and they just need a little bit of talking about it, and they can go back to normal, so to speak, if there is such a thing as normalness. I like the term normativity. But these are very complicated questions. You have other schools of thought that don't pathologize, but yet, talk about the fact that we suffer. And so hence, the term patient, when I'm using that term, that's the Latin for patens, from the Greek pathos, those who suffer. To be human is to suffer. Some people have different forms of suffering. They could be more traumatic. They could be more depressed. So, and there could be overlaps in all these things. Hence, the personality disorder profile You could have individuals that have these things happen through various aspects of their life. They feel more depleted these times, more hostile these times, more vacuous, more traumatized, more aggressive. So the question's a good one, and I don't profess to have the answer.
Uma última questão, para não sermos nós abusadores do tempo do professor Mills. Alguém tem uma última questão a fazer?
Why
The last one, okay?
Sure.
why some people who have that traumas develop personality disorders and others are more resilient? You think it's because of genetics? Why some people don't develop personality disorders and others become like this?
Yeah, I'll tell you my bias up front. That I don't believe a biological model or a genetic model really can even remotely explain personality, let alone personality disorders. We're way too complex. We're much more social beings, and hence a gene's not going to necessarily, be the cause of a complex system that we call the psyche. So, if anything, there will be some perhaps interactional aspects to the fact that we are embodied. I mean, we can't deny that. We might have certain predispositions or tendencies toward this or that, but ultimately, it could not remotely be a cause. We're social and cultural animals. We interact with people. We're always in an intersubjective relation to the world. And hence, the fact that we identify with so many different aspects of experiencing and relating and being, that we internalize this incredible cornucopia of values, of desires, of defenses, of ideals, of aspirations that are social or cultural manifestations that are part of the mere fact that we're thrown into a social ontology. So that again is my bias, but however, the simplistic binary between the environment versus genes or biology versus culture is a false binary.
Então, thank you again for your
Well, my pleasure. And thank you for
brilliant
hosting
talk.
me.